after 58 that the arms have been in the studio, and at the end we see the hustle, and you mentioned in the insert that it's the year when the Lebanese Civil War broke out. So perhaps you could tell us something about your your work on the relation between images and history, society.
Working on this archive is like working on an indirect chronicle, because the aim of the photographer was not to he was not a press photographer. He was a photographer, a studio photographer that from time to time did pictures outside his studio whenever clients wanted to. So I define it as a theater because he allowed people to stage themselves exactly, and he had accessories, etc., etc. But there are moments where you find echoes of what's happening outside in the studio, and notably with the arms, because they started coming into the studio after 58 with the small revolution of 1958, and then from there on they never stopped from coming. So it was excessive use of arms. But then that's it. Yeah, in 1975 you start seeing a few pictures of the demonstrations, for example, and the burial ceremony of this deputy, of this Saga deputy. Yeah, so I like working indirectly on the war through working on records of people, just records of living, in fact. Yeah, but as you said, it's the space of the studio is a space of performance.
Is there another contribution? You can hardly see you, that's why. I mean, I would have another question. I was always wondering, and it's in the first half of the film, and at a certain point you decide to go outside of the studio, on the beach, and to the hairdressers. And this refers to the photos we have seen in the studio, but yeah, I always wonder why you, how come?
The film was, originally the film was structured as going back and forth from the studio to locations, and then I kept on removing them and kept those two only because they are in the middle where the film starts, or like in the center of the film, because the title of the film is right in the middle. In my opinion, the film starts in the middle, and what you see is like prologue, or like pre-film. So I've I'm not sure if it was the right choice, by the way, to keep that in the middle. Maybe in another life I would just remove them. But yeah, I mean, just to tell you, in the beginning, it was like but it was 2 hours and a half. I mean, the first edit was 2 hours and a half. So if I wanted to keep this in and out, it would have been really too tiring, I think. Because one way of performing the archive also is to go into location. One way of which I've done in previous films, like This Day, for example, where I go to the place where a photograph was taken in Syria and look for the woman who was photographed 50 years ago, and things like this. So there are numerous ways, numerous directions to take while working on an archive in order to know more, or in order to construct a narrative. And this film takes multiple roads, in my opinion. So you see traces of this by going to hairdressers, because they're still very common in Saigon. And that location of the seaside, it's still like a major swimming place in the city. It's the only public beach in the city. So part of me going there is part of my social interest, also in recording, or like part of my anthropological interest as well.
Speaking of, because you just mentioned your previous work, perhaps we should mention, for those who are not familiar with your previous films, that is not the first time that you work with material of El Madani's archive. And in this film we have his films, we have his photographs, and we have his testimony. This doesn't end in a question.
It's true. But I used part of his work of the people with guns in this day, for example, and I used his images of the Ta'mir project in Al-Halwi in Refusing Pilot. In 2 films before this one.
So you mentioned that he is still going to the to the studio.
He's 86 years old.
Yeah.
He goes for 2 hours only when it's not too cold. But if it's too rainy and too cold, he just skips. But normally he likes to go, although he doesn't take pictures anymore. But for him, it's just a quiet time. He just goes there, sits. For him, it's a jump in time as well. And have his time for himself, because at home he's surrounded by family and he likes to just take a break also.
I found very compelling, and I'm curious about your intent, the juxtaposition of the Western music from Michael Jackson and the hustle onto these dancing videos. I thought it really just kind of lowered a sphere of violence onto the videos. And I guess I'm curious, what compelled you to make that part of this?
Particularly there was, it's a long answer. The key to the answer is this piece on YouTube, this video on YouTube, where you see Saudi guys, Saudi men, dancing with their traditional clothes on a Michael Jackson song. And for long I kept this on my list of videos to show or to work on, because it was very ambiguous and I was not sure if they were really dancing on Michael Jackson or if that music was superposed onto them. After a lot of viewing, I decided that it was actually superposed onto them, because I've seen a lot of Saudi dance, and because of that, and I was becoming familiar with the music, with the gestures, and obviously they were not singing on Michael Jackson. But also, on another hand, Michael Jackson is admired in Saudi Arabia. So I don't see a contradiction between the two cultures. So I tried myself to do the same. So I took a lot of Dabki dances and I superposed on them Michael Jackson and others, and I realized that they work perfectly. So it's really the beat. Beat has a relationship to our body, and we dance to beat, and irrespective of dancing to Arabic music or Western music, recent or past or tribal music. Actually, Michael Jackson's music could work well on any kind of dance. And this is why I started to play with it and stretch it a little bit earlier in the film to cover other people, the ones playing with snow, and stretch it a little bit farther on other people dancing Dabki. And it's there where I started to be interested in the notion of applying Western music on other forms of traditional dance, like this teacher teaching women belly dancing, for example, and I realized that it also works well. So these in fact explain the Michael Jackson piece, the Michael Jackson YouTube video.
Any more question or comment? If not, I thank you for your interest.
Thank you for
And
your
I will
presence.
thank you again for your film, Akram.